first of all, I want to say thank you. One of the things that I have learned about myself is that when I am doing things for the first time, like I am this, it's good for me to kind of have a dry run. And so, as I was trying to think about presenting this on Thursday, I thought, it'd be good to have a couple of people chime in first and kind of give some immediate feedback. So I appreciate you taking the time. I am fully aware a lot of you are going to be multitasking, kind of listening along and working. Believe me, I understand, and I am appreciative that you are tuning in at all to hear this. But I'm going to go ahead and do share my screen, and we're just going to kind of walk through the slides, and then we'll have some time for questions. So I've entitled this our transition update and report, and that's kind of a catch-all, but a little history, a few insights, and a whole lot of random observations from Brian. That's what I'm calling this. So we entered officially into leadership transition on January 1st of 2023. So we're into our ninth month, basically wrapping up our ninth month of this leadership transition. And on January 1st, I stepped into the role as acting head of staff. And as part of that role, I have kind of sought to kind of shepherd along some of the core transition tasks as I saw them, and also based on the feedback primarily from members of the executive committee, but also members of the special nominating committee. But for those of you who weren't in on those conversations, I want to kind of let you know, how did we get to September 26th? What have we done in the transition so far? So the first one was what I call the information gathering phase. We did the landscape study at the end of 2022. We had an excellent response, 406 responses to that. And we're talking more about this later, but the first kind of data point we picked up is that Pittsburgh Presbytery scored as a recovery quadrant ministry, low energy, low satisfaction. And Michelle Snyder, who's a consultant that we worked with, said that that organizations in this quadrant need a back to basics approach to ministry. So at the March Executive Committee retreat, when you see EC, that's what it means, Executive Committee, along with a few members of the Special Nominating Committee, took an in-depth look at the role of a presbytery as defined by the Book of Order and the recent history of the presbytery. If we're going to talk about back to basics, it made the most sense to just say, okay, let's go back to the very basics, to the very kind of core. Why does a presbytery exist? What are the responsibilities? And these two processes, kind of going through the landscape study and the Book of Order review, constitute the main primary information gathering steps for the transition. Before I go further, this came out of the Executive Committee retreat. It's helpful then for us to identify some definitions, because the word presbytery means a lot of different things, a lot of different contexts, depending on who says it and what they mean. So here's what I mean. There's one definition of the presbytery that refers to the community. The community is that which is defined by the Book of Order. A presbytery is constituted by its member congregations and its minister members. So when I say the community, that's what I mean. I mean the people and organizations that make up the presbytery. The system is the structure the presbytery utilizes to accomplish its ministry. So when I talk about the system, I'm saying the things we do, the setup by which we do what we are called to do, versus the community, which is the people, right? So when people say we are the presbytery, that's the community definition. And when people are upset about an action the presbytery took, they're talking about the system. Capacity. This is my phrase for the resources, human, physical, and financial, that the presbytery has at its disposal to carry out its ministry. So when I talk about capacity, that's my short word for that. And what I want to kind of talk about is some real basic understanding of how systems function, right? So the system seeks to support the community, but there's a reciprocal relationship. Well, what do I mean by that? The community in general provides capacity for the system, and the system in turn provides resources and services for the community, right? In a balanced system, the size of the system is in line with the size of the community and the capacity that the community can provide. Let me give you an example. In a congregation, the people provide financial and human resources to the system. So you've got giving, you've got volunteers, you've got staff who have been hired, which in turn governs and funds operations, including staff, programs, and physical plant, right? The system then provides, and some of you will recoil in horror at this phrase, goods and services, right? I'm using a business term here, but worship on Sunday, program opportunities, pastoral care to the community, right? So the idea is that there's an investment into the system, and the system then provides things to the community. And the idea is that this relationship is reciprocal. In communities with increasing size, where you've got a church that is growing numerically, what you end up having is a situation where the system is oftentimes being stretched because the community is growing, right? So this is why in fast-growing churches, you often have issues with financial impropriety, because the system, the checks and balances, the committee structures, the staffing hasn't caught up to the needs of the community. The upside of this, though, is that because the community is not used to a higher functioning system, you tend to get very low expectations and high levels of satisfaction. So if you've ever been a part of an organization that's in a startup phase that catches a lot of momentum and grows rapidly, you know that there's often a lot of excitement that comes with that because there's a lot of new that's happening, it's expanding, right? But it's also relatively easy to keep people very satisfied in growing systems because it just keeps getting better and better. There's more people there, there's more money to work with. That's easy, okay? On the flip side, communities with decreasing size, where there's fewer people, the community is often stretched to meet the system's needs because it no longer has the capacity that it once did. In this scenario, the community has higher expectations of the system to provide goods and services, but due to a diminished capacity, it can't do what it once did, and therefore satisfaction is lower. This is the line the presbytery used to, or the church used to, right? Things that we used to do when the capacity was greater and the system was larger and the community was larger, but we can no longer do. And in these systems, you often have very high expectations with very low levels of satisfaction. And we've seen that in some of our in congregations that have experienced a relatively rapid decline, where this kind of what I call like a system hangover, where people remember what used to be possible, what used to happen, and now doesn't because we've had the size. And as you can see on the graphic, the system and the community still basically have to be aligned, or else you're going to be in a deficit situation. But people have memories of when the system did a lot more. Okay, let's talk about Pittsburgh Presbytery. Within recent memory, and this is in my lifetime, Pittsburgh Presbytery had over 30 staff members, 180 congregations, and over 90,000 members. That was early 80s, by the way. Today we have 7 staff members, 7.5 to be specific, 120-ish congregations, and approximately 20,000 members. What you'll notice is while we have lost 70,000 members in the last 40 years, we've only lost about 60 congregations. So we've lost well over 2/3 of our members, but only approximately 1/3 of our congregations. What does it tell us? Our congregations are smaller, and we know that. The last time the Presbytery went through a significant reorganization was in 2011, 2012, and it was a result of the system exceeding its capacity and resulted in a significant reduction in staff. So again, we are one of those systems in which we are in a decline. So much larger people have a memory of when the system did a lot more because there was a lot more capacity, but we haven't been able to sustain that as the size of the community has shrunk, and therefore we'd expect expectations to be high and overall satisfaction to be low. Within the last 20 years, we've kind of had 2 different models of how the presbytery, the system, should function. The first was presbytery as resource. This was the model in essence from 1997 to 2012. And this envisioned the presbytery system collecting, organizing, and producing resources that then flowed downstream to congregations and individuals. Congregations were organized by size. So we had large church, medium-sized church, small church, and individual program areas. Stewardship, commission on ministry, spiritual making, disciple making, and spiritual growth, mission and social justice. And that's how it was designed. It was designed to resource out to the congregations. From 2013 to now, we kind of did this, what we call presbytery as connector. And this was the idea behind the branch system. The idea was that the presbytery, mainly through branch, so geographically focused meetings, would try and connect as a means of peer resourcing. And everything was structured on the branch system. Congregations were organized by geography, and staffing was assigned in a similar pattern, right? So the staffing model completely shifted between staffing by program area and church size to by geography. Where are we now? The reorganization of the presbytery envisioned fewer large meetings. So once upon a time, Pittsburgh Presbytery had 7 meetings a year, with the bulk of the connecting and equipping work of the presbytery occurring within regular branch meetings. That was the idea. That was the goal. Looking back at the mission study and the documentation, that was the plan, was that we'd reduce the number of large meetings. Those would be business focused, and the branch meetings would become the center point for what we call connecting and equipping. So training, education, getting to know people, forming those relationships to increase collaboration, connecting across different projects and shared interests. That was the goal of the branch system. The branch system initially generated a fair amount of energy, but that energy dissipated over time, and ultimately branch level activity slowly faded out. No branch survived a change in staff person without a significant, if not total, loss in momentum. So in the early 2012, 2013, 2014 eras, the branches kind of bumped along. And then as staff began to shift, some branches maintained a great deal of momentum. West Branch, for example, was probably the most active branch, not probably, was the most active branch, and continued regular meetings for up until very recently. But ultimately, when a staff person changed or a significant pastor left that branch, that was pretty much in every case where the momentum on branch meetings kind of petered out. And this can't be understated. We have, as opportunities have arisen, sought to decrease our staff size as well. So just to give you the 7 years that I've been on staff, in 2016, we had 10.25 full-time equivalent staff persons, a full-time general minister, 3 full-time associates, a 3/4-time state clerk, business administrator, financial administrator, 3 support staff, and a half-time custodian. We now have 7.5 full-time equivalent staff persons. Now, some of these changes happened for other reasons. For example, when Crestfield was spun out into its own organization, the need for financial administration went down. So in that case, we didn't have the need for a full-time financial administrator anymore. But others, it was simply financial capacity. We could not continue to support the size of staff that we had, even in 2016, when I arrived, into the future. So when Ayana Teeter left, her position was in essence eliminated. The state clerk job became full-time. We've made some small changes, but in essence, we've shed about 2 full-time equivalent positions in support and leadership staff within the last 7 years in order to match up with our capacity. Any questions real quick on any of that? Okay, and I'm going to keep rolling. Okay, so what did we learn from the landscape study? Well, as I said, we learned that we were in the recovery quadrant as a presbytery. We scored approximately in the 10th percentile in energy. Only 17% of respondents reported a high level of energy around the work and ministry of the presbytery. Everyone else was either on the fence or low. We scored in the 3rd percentile in satisfaction, with only 18% of respondents reported being satisfied or very satisfied. Again, 49%, half the people, were very much on the fence, kind of neither satisfied nor dissatisfied, with 33% of respondents being dissatisfied. And we were trending downward in satisfaction. 51% of respondents said that they felt that that they were less satisfied with their involvement in the work of the presbytery than they had been 5 years ago. 36% saying the same, only 13% saying that they were more satisfied. So one of the nice parts about the landscape study is that it also, in the data, was able to identify what are called drivers. A driver basically says this: if this is done well, satisfaction will increase. And there's a correlation that they use. I won't get into the formula, but it basically says that these seem to be the things that people feel are important, but not necessarily being done well. So the questions are phrased in the positive, but then respondents, if you remember the survey, are asked to evaluate how true they believe that statement to be. And these are the 4 that came to the top in our data. Number 1, our presbytery leadership has done a good job developing a shared vision that unites us. Number 2, members have discovered that involvement in the work of our presbytery can be a source of energy and spiritual renewal. Number 3, effective communication. As a presbytery, we do a good job communicating with one another in a way that keeps us aware and engaged. And number 4, our presbytery has been successful in helping vital congregations like mine, or congregations like mine, become more vital and effective. These were our 4 drivers. And actually, after this, there was a fairly significant drop off. So these 4 very, very clearly rose to the top. And again, the idea is if we make progress in these 4 areas, the data would indicate that satisfaction will go up. So in the work that we did after, working with some people from executive committee, Kathy Smith, who's the pastor at Bethel, picked up on this. I thought it was really good. That basically these fit into 2 nice categories of connections, shared vision, involvement, and effective communication, right? Those are internally focused intra-presbytery system things, and outward focus on our congregations. So item 1, develop a shared vision. Now, if you read my P News article, you notice that at the very beginning of this process, I said, we're not going to waste our time just rewriting and writing statements. They're not helpful. They don't do any good. And yet here we are. So let's talk a little bit about why we ended up working on shared vision first. Just in basic review of mission and vision, why do we exist and what do we do? That's what you're trying to say, right? What's the purpose? And there's a theoretical reason that this was the right thing to start with. Before we do anything, we must answer the question, why do we exist and who are we called to be? But I will be really honest with you that this drive toward revisiting these statements was much more pragmatic than that. Number 1, we needed it for the general minister job description. This process mainly started when I was meeting with personnel and we were looking over the current job description. And it said, the general minister helps Pittsburgh Presbytery fulfill its purpose by. And we went, well, what's the purpose? Number 2, this was a big one for me. The old MIF, the old ministry information form that used to be the form that we had congregations and mid-councils fill out for job openings, had a simple, what is this organization's mission statement? It was one simple question. It wasn't a big deal. In the middle of our transition process here, this system changed, and it now requires a mission and vision statement. And the mission statement we had was relatively recent. It was written during the last reorganization in the early 2010s. And to be honest, if we just had to put the mission statement on the MDP, we probably wouldn't have necessarily prioritized this. But the vision statement, I actually called Sheldon on this. I was like, did you write this? And he said, no. He said, I inherited that. We tweaked it a little bit, but in essence, it's the same one. What my observation was that the current vision statement for the presbytery reflected a very different time and place than we find ourselves in now. And the example that I can point to that is most direct is it says, the staff of the presbytery equips the saints for ministry. Right in the vision statement, it assigned the primary responsibility for doing the equipping work to the staff. Now, if you think, oh, well, when you have 16 people on staff, that's appropriate. When you have 7, maybe it's not. And that was kind of, for me, the tipping point where I said, okay, we need to revisit this at a much more full level than just trying to tweak, because that time has really passed where I think that statement really holds up. And last, the results of the landscape study said so, right? Like, develop a shared vision that unites us. Okay, so what do we do? Well, I talked about it a little bit already. We reviewed the book of order. We looked at the landscape study. We looked at the current statements. We worked with the Next Step team and landscape team. Their names are on the next slide. But this is what was really helpful. We consulted with 4 other presbyteries: National Capital, which is DC area, New Hope, which is in North Carolina, Greater Atlanta, and Newcastle. National Capital, New Hope, and Greater Atlanta are all peer presbyteries. They're similar in size. They are somewhat geographically focused like we are, although they're all cover a bigger geography than us. It's not like they're half the state. And so for that reason, they were really helpful conversation partners. And they had all done the landscape study. And they had all scored higher than we had on the landscape study. So we had kind of a common language to start with. Newcastle Presbytery was helpful to talk to. They are not a peer presbytery. They are significantly smaller than we are. But one of their executives is a former minister member of Pittsburgh. And so she was able to share with us some insights of being in presbytery leadership outside of the Pittsburgh world, but understanding how Pittsburgh is laid out. And those were really helpful conversations for, I think, all who participated, just to get an idea of how different presbyteries are functioning. We spent some time praying. We spent some time brainstorming. We drafted statements. We refined statements. We kind of got a good draft around the beginning of July, and all during July, every time that Ralph and Louise, Carla was on sabbatical, so she missed the fun, but every time we got together, I put them in front of Ralph and Louise, and I said, okay, what do you think? And we refined and we refined and we tweaked. And even up until the very end, the last meeting before this went to executive committee, we were tweaking again, finding different words that we thought captured a sense that we had. And this, just so you know, who is on the two different teams, you'll see that there is some crossover. There's also some difference between the two. The Next Step team came out of the executive committee retreat. It included 2 members from the special nominating committee. The landscape team was kind of a follow-up that was all made up of executive committee members that kind of finished this work. So it got its start with the Next Steps group, but it was the landscape group that really served as a sounding board as we kind of brought this to a conclusion. So what did we realize? What did we learn? Number one, the roles and responsibilities of a presbytery are very well defined in the Book of Order. The bottom line truth is there's not a lot there for us to like figure out. It pretty much says these are the responsibilities of a presbytery. Number two, the presbytery community and organizational capacity has rapidly changed. Here's another bit of data. In 2008, we did the precursor to the landscape study after Jim Mead left before Sheldon came. There were 1,000 respondents. In 2022, we had 400 respondents, 60% fewer, right? There's not another data point. The staff, 16 full-time employees in 2010, we are at 7 currently, right? Even before the reorganization that got us to the 10 when I joined the staff, we were at 16 prior to that. And this was the theme that kept coming up. There was a consistent theme of emphasizing the work of our congregations as a primary focus. And what do I mean by that? Well, I'm going to give you 2 examples. In our conversation with Greater Atlanta Presbytery, their executive made the comment that a couple of years ago, they went as far as to change the staff members' job titles from associate executives to congregational consultants. They went to a congregational consulting model that said the role of the presbytery system through its commissions and committees and staff is to consult with congregations rather than kind of organize and direct. That was interesting. The other interesting comment was John Molina Moore, my colleague in National Capital Presbytery, gave the example where he said, look, if there's a well to be dug somewhere, the presbytery doesn't do the digging of the well. We find congregations that are interested in digging a well, and we connect them and we help them organize. But the presbytery actually doesn't do much. I thought that was a really interesting comment from both of these presbyteries that said, look, we really kind of let our congregations set the direction, and we as presbytery try and align our systems and structures to connect and facilitate and to support that work. So this is how we got to the current, newly adopted, I shouldn't say current, the newly adopted purpose statement. This is the full version. Pittsburgh Presbytery is a covenant community of Jesus Christ that exists to assist and support the witness of our congregation and members as we actively participate in the mission of the triune God in the world. That's the full version. The short one, Pittsburgh Presbytery exists to assist and support the witness of our congregations and members. So you can see, we did carry over some of the language from the previous mission statement. The language around covenant community and mission of the triune God, those are holdovers. Those are things that when we looked at those statements, we said, these are still good. This is strong language and we need it there. But you'll also see that it defines a little bit more the primary agent. The previous definitions talked about what the presbytery would do. This statement says the presbytery will kind of follow the lead of its congregations and its ministers and members as they actively participate in the mission of the triune God in the world. There's some nuance there. It's different. What I'll say for me personally is I think it's more reflective of reality, of where we are as a system and what our current capacity is. I remember I've been connected to Pittsburgh Presbytery for 20 years at this point. And I remember when the presbytery system had the capacity to organize and direct and lead. And after having been on staff for 7 years, I can tell you, we don't have that capacity anymore, right? I remember fondly when, we would have 5 or 6 different companies come in with their VBS and curriculum stuff and do curriculum review and VBS review downstairs in the resource room. We had the capacity and the bandwidth to do that work. We just don't anymore. We much more now have to be responding to what's going on in our congregations rather than kind of setting direction for it. It's a shift that's been necessitated by the system and the changes that we've seen as far as our capacity goes. But how are we going to do it? This, to me, is a significant shift. Remember, I told you that the last vision statement said the staff will equip the saints for ministry. Our strategy statement says to accomplish this, Pittsburgh Presbytery, through our commissions, staff, and ministry teams, right? So we're not taking staff off the hook. We still have a larger staff than most presbyteries do for sure, but we're broadening it. We're specifically naming that our commissions and our ministry teams have an important role to play. And this is what we're going to do. We're going to gather church leaders and connect them for shared ministry and mutual benefit. That really comes out of language around the branch system, by the way. Resources them through grants and collaboration sharing. There's some level of resourcing we can still do. It just can't be our primary aim and end anymore. Advise and assist them through challenges and transitions. I'll be honest with you, that's some of the most important work that the staff does. When we have a church that's in a challenging situation, be it conflict or pastoral transition, that's where we most have to prioritize our time. Cultivates an environment that encourages them to innovate and experiment with new forms of ministry. This comes directly out of our work in new worship communities and the administrative commission on transformation, right? We want to continue to encourage both new forms of ministry and existing ministries to try and innovate and to try new things, and equips and encourages them as they proclaim the good news of Christ in word and deed. This speaks to our work within advocacy and social justice, right? It goes beyond just Sunday morning in the work that we do. Now, these are strategy statements, right? They say they are aspirational. This is what we're going to do as we seek to accomplish our purpose statement, right? That's the connection. What you will notice, though, is that these are more utilitarian. These aren't vision statements that necessarily talk about what we hope to see happen. I think in a back to basics era, we really need to be very clearly defined about what it is that we're going to do and how it is that we're going to try and do it. And that to me kind of illustrates well that back to basics approach of just saying, here's what we're going to do, and here's how we're going to try and do it. How do we implement this? I'm just going to buzz through this quickly. You've already seen, I put it in the P News. We're doing a presentation at the Presbytery meeting. The next phase is going to be every commission and ministry team is going to be asked to submit a report. This sounds heavy-handed. It's not. It's coming from me, so it's not going to be heavy-handed. It's not how I roll. Briefly explaining how they have fulfilled the purpose and strategy statement and identifying potential goals for the future. And review. This is really important to me. At the executive committee retreat each year, we're going to revise and review the purpose and strategy statements. And here's why. Times change, leadership changes, and as those things change, we must continually adapt our understanding of our purpose and how we'll accomplish it. Here's what I mean. At some point, we're going to bring in a new general minister. And the new general minister is going to sit down and see these and be like, well, that's great, but what about my input? And I think it's really important we say at the outset, this is for right now, for this season. This March of 2024, the executive committee will take another look at these. Maybe it's time for some tweaks, some revisions. I can see, especially in the strategy statements, let's add a word here. Let's change this, right? Let's add this as a point of emphasis and focus. This, to me, especially in a transition, we need to hold on to these loosely and be open to revision as we're moving through the process so they don't become stagnant and kind of time-bound. I'm going to pause there for any questions. Okay, not seeing anyone on mute, so I will keep going. So that's where we are, right? That's what has actually happened so far. Everything from here on out are some of my observations and thought as we move into the next phase of our life together as a presbytery. But that's where we are as of now, is that we have adopted a new purpose and strategy statement there on our website. We're going to begin to update things, and we're going to start some of those implementation steps. But that's where we are. So what's next? Well, let's go back to landscape study for a minute. We talked about those two categories of connections and congregations, right? Of the internal connectedness, related to shared vision, involvement, effective communication, and our congregations. So what did people want? So what's interesting about the landscape study is that there's two different categories. One says these are things that are important. These are values I have, but there's also priorities. One of the questions said, where do you want additional effort placed? This is what came up. 1, 3, and 4 all had the word equip. 3 of the top 4 priorities all said equip. Equip congregations, equip clergy. You can see them on your screen. Second one overall was build trust. And this one was really interesting to me because one of the things on the landscape study is that not only did it show you the priorities, it also showed you where you were compared to other mid-councils and where that priority was. And our equipping numbers were basically average, where other mid-councils have them. But for building trust, it was higher than normal. It was higher than average, which to me said, okay, this trust piece, this is a really important piece for our people, okay? But you can see the priorities really focused on these two things of, as we move ahead, we want to spend extra effort in the equipping work of the presbytery and trying to build trust within the presbytery. So where do we go from here? Well, this is how I put it together in my head. And some of you who are artistically inclined would do like a graphic organizer. I don't work in graphic organizers, I work in spreadsheets. So you got a spreadsheet. Sorry. If you want to put this in a graphic organizer, if any of you feel called, please do, because it'll look prettier. But here's what I want you to focus on. As we pieced all these together, I noticed 2 lanes. We already talked about that, right? The connectional lane, the connections within the presbytery, and the congregational lane. But you'll also notice that the areas of focus, those drivers around shared vision, involvement, and communication, all directly relate to trust. If those 3 things are done well, if we have a shared vision that people are on board with, if people value their involvement life of the presbytery, and if communication is happening effectively, trust in the system will go up. At the same time, if we're doing a good job of equipping, right, we are likely to have vital congregations that are able to fulfill their mission better. And I suddenly kind of saw this all really fits together of these 2 different directions of connections and congregations, these areas of focus and the core values that came out of landscape. It all kind of fits together. And I think gives us a pretty clear map moving forward. So let's talk about where I think we should go. Number 1, develop a shared vision for the ministry of the presbytery. Executive committee has already worked on that. We've talked about that a lot. Number 4, we need to place a renewed emphasis on equipping our congregations and leaders for the ministry to which God has called them. We've already started on this work. Last spring, we hosted an elder and deacon training event at Beulah Presbyterian Church. I will be the first to admit that I thought it was too late. We weren't going to get anybody to sign up. It wasn't going to be a success. I'm proud to report I was wrong. We had a great crowd. It was very well responded to. In the same vein, coming up this fall, we have 3 more events that we're doing. 1 on church safety, 1 on training for children and youth ministry leaders, and 1 on addressing systemic racism. We've got 3 more events, all that are aimed at this, equipping our congregations and leaders for the ministry to which God has called them. We've already moved on these kind of 2 areas because it was so clear that these were areas that we needed to push ahead on. So already, and actually in the budget on Thursday, you will find out that we are proposing a reorganization of the budget around a couple budget lines and adding an additional $10,000 to 1 budget line specifically to fund these equipping type ministries that we are going to take on. So we've already moved on these priorities. Here's the other 2, and these are strictly my idea. That's why it says this is only an idea. And they're very loose, but to foster a culture in which involvement in the ministry of the presbytery is a source of energy and spiritual renewal. What would that look like? As I said, that's a very aspirational goal. There's not a lot of teeth there, but that's one of my thoughts as a starting point for conversation. And enhance communications. Develop a comprehensive communication strategy aligned with the 2023 purpose and strategy statements that aims to increase awareness and engagement within the life of our presbytery. If you were on Facebook today, you'll notice that just for fun, I threw a video up on Facebook. Not saying I'm going to do it all the time, but I was sitting in my office and I said, hey, let's throw one up on Facebook to talk about the meeting on Thursday and what people should know about coming to Crestfield. We're not at the comprehensive strategy part. We're trying some different things. You might notice in the P News, we've tweaked a couple things. We're starting to experiment, but we don't really have a concrete plan here. Again, these are just my ideas. The executive committee hasn't really moved on these. This is the part that I wanted to get to, and then we'll be done. But this is more on that shared vision piece, because this is where I got really, really interested, and I think there's a lot here for us to consider. If you remember, one of the phrase was, our Presbyterian leadership has done a good job identifying a shared vision that unites us. The question is, what unites us? And how can we know what unites us? Does anything unite us? Well, the fun part is we actually have some really good data on that. Since 2014, 14 of our congregations have completed Holy Cow Consulting's church assessment tool, yielding a total of almost 2,300 responses. So in the last 10 years, we have asked almost 2,300 people connected to our congregation for information. Interestingly enough, this equates to a little more than 10% of our churches, a little more than 10% of our members. And using this data, we can learn a lot about our presbytery as a whole. Now, I'm not going to show you the individual numbers for each of the congregations, but I do want you to see the 14 congregations that are in the data set: Riverdale, Bethany, Mount Pleasant, Eastminster, Westminster, Crossroads, East Liberty, Unity and Plum, Forest Hills, Beulah, Oakmont, Southminster, Ben Avon, and Open Door. What you also need to know is that Riverdale is the oldest data set. They did it in 2014. Bethany did it in 2017. Everybody else is 2018, 2019, or newer. So this is not old data. Most of this is within 5 years of present. A lot of them actually were either done during or after COVID. So this is a pretty up-to-date data set that we're working with here. So what do we find? What you'll hear is that we are theologically divided, right? That within the Presbytery, within the PCUSA, we are deeply theologically divided. And what's fun about CAT-SCAN is CAT-SCAN has questions that get at that, okay? And you can see them on the screen in front of you. Now, your reaction might be what my reaction is the first time I saw these questions. Those feel old. Those feel dated. Those don't necessarily reflect common language today. Like, those are not necessarily helpful questions. I hear you. Here's what I'll also tell you. Those questions, they still work. I admit they're a little dated. I don't love the language. I wish they could be retooled. But I'll tell you what, when I looked at the results of the congregations that completed the assessment, what I can tell you is that these questions still work. They still ascertain an accurate read of a congregation's kind of theological perspective and spectrum. So what do we find out? Are we theologically divided? We are theologically diverse. Our congregations range from the 4th percentile to the 98th percentile in theological perspective. Now, to put that in context, that's against other churches in Holy Cow's database. Most of Holy Cow's work is done with mainline Evangelical Lutheran, Episcopal, Methodist, American Baptist, Presbyterian churches. Not all. They've done work with Southern Baptists and EPC. They've done work beyond the mainline, but mostly it's mainline. So what's safe to say is that within Pittsburgh Presbytery, we have congregations that represent the full spectrum of mainline churches within the United States, from the 4th percentile being our most theologically progressive to the 98th percentile being our most theologically conservative. Keep in mind, these are new data sets, right? So that 98th percentile church, that was within the last 2 years. That 4th percentile church, that was in the last 2 years too. Strictly speaking, by church, remember of those 14 congregations, our average congregation is in the 71st percentile theologically, slightly conservative. But if we adjust for church size, our average respondent in Pittsburgh Presbytery is in the 51st percentile, right smack dab in the middle. So, does theological perspective affect priorities? It does, but maybe not as much as you would think. This is a lot of information. I'm going to go past it, so because I actually talk about this on the other slides. But here's what I found out. Pretty much, no matter what the theological bent of your congregation is, it doesn't really affect what people said the priorities, what they felt was most important for their congregation are. As it turns out, theological diversity doesn't really correlate to being divided. Here's what I mean. Regardless of theology, reaching new people and incorporating them into the life of the congregation was the #1 average priority for our congregations. And it was in the top 2 of every single one of those congregations. Making changes to attract family, children, and youth comes in a solid second. Progressives do rank this lower, but it still gets a 3.6. And one of those congregations, and there's a reason for this, rated that as their 15th priority. If I take them out of the data set, it moves solidly up to 2.8, right into the second overall position. So now I'm going to go back to the slide. So as you can see, Develop and implement a comprehensive strategy to reach new people, incorporate them in the life of the church. Overall, this was 1.3. Progressive congregations, it was a 1.1. Moderate congregations, a 1.7. Conservative congregations, a 1.2. Make necessary changes to attract families with children and youth, 2.8 overall, 3.6 for our progressive congregations, 1.3 for our moderate congregations, 2.7 for our conservative congregations. Here's what I want you to notice. Notice that the numbers here are actually closer between our progressive churches and our conservative churches than they are our moderate churches. Keep that in mind. I'm going to come back to that. The next two of the 4 priorities are the same across the board, and that is developing ministries to work toward healing those broken by life circumstances and creating more opportunities for people to form meaningful relationships come in at the third and fourth highest priority across the board, irrespective of theological perspective. What does this tell us? Well, here's the rest of the story. After that, the numbers do diverge considerably. However, this divergence is more closely related to physical location than theology. Here's what I mean. More socially minded priorities draw predictably higher numbers from progressives. But conservatives aren't far behind, scoring the same when it comes to revitalizing the neighborhood, 7th priority overall, but slightly lower in expanding outreach ministries to those on the margins, 7th priority versus 5th. Our moderate congregations, those that fell in the middle of theological perspective, are in solidly suburban communities and rank the socially minded initiatives lower than both our progressive and our conservative congregations. So what's my conclusion? Well, as we move ahead, I think we need to keep this in mind. Despite our significant theological differences, please do not hear me saying our theological differences don't matter. They do. They are real. We have data to back it up. There's only a slight variance in the ranking of priorities that our people want their congregations to concentrate on. And as we look from a presbytery level at how we do that work of equipping saints for ministry, we need to keep this in mind, right? We know what people want their churches to focus on. We know what they feel is important. Theological diversity is a factor to always be considered, for sure, but it's not necessarily determinative in the type of topics and things that people seem to be most interested in. And the top-ranking priorities speak directly to congregational vitality and actively engaging their surrounding communities, right? So what didn't score high? What didn't score high, people are very satisfied with their buildings. People are not looking to expand buildings in our presbytery. People, by and large, were very happy with the music in their church. Things like that didn't score high anywhere. They were all kind of down toward the bottom. It was remarkably consistent. If you go back to this chart here now that I've kind of given you the overview, you'll see that certain things did vary, right? There's a lot of variance, but a lot of it had a lot more to do, I think, with physical location than necessarily theology. The overall trends were pretty consistent across the board, regardless of the theological perspective of the congregation. There's a lot of detail there, but that's my main takeaway, is that it was pretty consistent. For fun, I emailed this chart to you that you see in front of you. I emailed it to Michelle Snyder, who did our work with landscape and works with Holy Cow. And she said, yes, that makes perfect sense. That lines up that when you have churches out of a similar tradition, you tend to find a lot more commonality, even where there exists significant theological differences in perspective. All right, last slide, and then I will stop the recording. So I just wanted you to see the full list of priorities and kind of what people identified and focused on. So on the right side, these are what I call the community or socially minded ones. Expand outreach ministries that provide direct services, those living on the margins of society, and work to renew and revitalize the community around the church by building coalitions with partners. Those were the outwardly focused, what I call socially minded initiatives. The congregational vitality ones focus on new people, attracting children and youth, developing ministries, working toward healing those broken by life circumstances, increasing a sense of fellowship and connection, strengthening the process by which members are called and equipped for ministry, increasing opportunities for Christian education, and developing spiritual generosity. Pretty much across the board, that's what we saw. That's what people really identified as being the most important for them and for their congregations. So why do I think that this is helpful? And then I'm going to stop talking, I promise. I think this is helpful because I think it recognizes two things. Number one, the theological diversity within Pittsburgh Presbytery is there. It can't be disputed. We have congregations at every step along the spectrum, from the 4th percentile to the 20th percentile to the 35th percentile to the 50th percentile to the 60th to the 70, 80, 90th. We have congregations across the spectrum. But that being a real factor, beyond that, there's a lot that our people are identifying as a shared sense of this is what's important for our congregation to focus on. Now, the theological perspective, does that impact it? Of course it does. But it's interesting to me that there's so much correlation, so much uniformity, and so much of it is based a lot on geographical location, more so than necessarily the theological perspective. I think as we move ahead, as we think about some of those priorities we've yet to develop, where do we want to focus as far as equipping people for ministry? Where do we want to focus as far as the communication pieces, as what people would find valuable to being involved in life of the presbytery? We need to keep this information at the forefront, because we know what people in our pews are looking for, what they need their congregations, or what they think their congregations should focus on. And I think it'd be to our own detriment to not kind of see that and say, okay, we've got a lot of correlation here, we've got a lot of similarity. Let's keep our theological differences in mind, but let's also realize that there's a lot that we do agree on as we figure out how to be a Presbyterian now in 2023 and into the future. I'm going to stop the share, and I'm going to